Hello everyone, welcome to learning class. So today in IELTS class we are gonna do the discussion of a reading passage, and the title of the passage is Australia and the Great War 1914 to 1918. So this is the reading passage that we are gonna solve today. So to save your precious time, this time I have already marked all the locations and even written the answers. So without wasting any time, let's proceed towards the solving of this reading. So first 7 questions are blanks. We have to write no more than 3 words, and then there comes 8 to 12 questions, and these are yes, no, not given. So let's begin with the first question that we have with us. According to the passage, Australia's view of itself is directly related to its involvement in the dash. So this is the blank, like Australia's view of Australia's view of itself is directly related to its involvement in what? So we have to answer the question what. So what, in which thing was Australia involved, which is directly related to its view of itself? So its answer is First World War or Great War. From the very first line of the passage, it is written that Australia's role in the, so from the word role we can also say involvement. Australia's role in the First World War or the Great War as it was known until 1939. So until 1939, First World War was known as the Great War. So either we can write First World War in the answer or Great War, because we do not have to write the Great War because the is already given in the question. So only Great War or either First World War. Australia's role in the First World War or the Great War as it was known until 1939 is central to the development of modern Australia's vision of itself in the world. So Australia's vision of itself, that means how Australia views itself, it is directly related to the Australia's role in the First World War, because this involvement is central to the development, which means it is directly related to the Australia's view of itself. So definitely our answer is gonna be First World War or Great War. Now let's move towards the second question. Soon after the war had begun, okay, after the beginning of the war, Australia's Prime Minister offered the dash. So what does the Australia's Prime Minister offered after the beginning of the war? Country's support. He offered the country's support. Now let's see where it is written. In the second paragraph, here it is written, first of all, in the first line, when the war broke out in 1914. So break out, it means like something, when something starts. So when the war broke out, which means that when the war started in 1914, so they are talking about the beginning of the war, it was certainty that because of long-standing economic, family and defense ties, Australia, along with New Zealand, would stand alongside Britain. So, in the war, Australia and New Zealand would fight alongside Britain, which means that they would be on the side of Britain. The then the Prime Minister, which was back at that time, the then Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher, was quick to pledge the country's support to the last man, the last shilling. So, pledge means like we have to formally give something. So Andrew Fisher, who was the Prime Minister of Australia back then when the war started, he was very quick to pledge the country's support. That means he offered country's support, he was the Prime Minister of country Australia, so he offered Australia's support in a way to the Britain, because they were fighting alongside Britain. So they pledged the country's support to the last man, the last shilling. That means to the last man in the war, they would help Britain in fighting the war. So definitely our answer is gonna be country support, because for offer they have used this synonym, which is pledge. So what was the thing that they offered? Country support. They pledged the country's support. Now next question. Australia had an early involvement in the war, and it is even possible that they were responsible for the dash. So, Australia had an early involvement in the war. That means they were involved in the war from the beginning, and it may be possible that they were responsible for the first shot. So, in this, we have to tell that what would be the possibility that they were responsible for which thing, for what thing they were responsible for. So the answer is first shot. That may be the first shot which after beginning of the war, first shot was like of Australia, from Australia to the enemy. So the first shot could have been of Australia. So this is what they were responsible for. It is just a possibility. So let's see where it is written. In the third paragraph, it is possible that the first shot of the war was fired in Australia, which is clearly our location, because they are saying that the first shot of the war, like after the war had begun, and then the first shot was fired in Australia, and it is a possibility, like it is written in the question. When a shot was fired across the bow of the German merchant ship Pfalz as it tried to escape from Port Arthur only a few hours after the declaration of war. That means only a few hours after the declaration of war, when the war had begun, and then it may be a possibility that the first shot of the war was fired in Australia. So this is the thing that Australia is responsible for, and it is just a possibility. Here also they have written this, and in the question also. So definitely our answer is gonna be first shot. Yes, Australia had an early involvement, same thing, it means like that, in the war, and it is even possible that they were responsible for the first shot. Now, fourth question. When combating the Turkish defense, that means when they were fighting the Turkey people, Turks, when they were fighting the Turkish defense, the British, French, and Anzac forces. So these were the three forces: British, French, and Australia plus New Zealand, that they are collectively called Anzac forces. So these were the three forces that were fighting the Turks. Okay, ended up attacking stronger points than they had originally intended, which means these three forces wanted to attack somewhere else on the points which they had originally intended, but they ended up do not attacking that points which they wanted to. They ended up attacking some other points, and which were strong points where the defense of the Turks was very high. So this only happened because of dash. So what was the reason that these three forces, British, French, and Anzac forces, were not able to attack on the points, on that points which they had originally wanted to, but they attacked on some other points which had stronger defenses? So what was the reason of this situation? Let's see. Fourth paragraph. At first, Australian forces were intended only to defend Australia, but in 1950, Australia-New Zealand Army Corps Anzac departed for Europe. So they departed for Europe. Their first stop was Egypt. And it was because they were so close that they were chosen to take part in the campaign to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. So they wanted to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. That is why they stopped at Egypt, the key to shipping into the Black Sea from the Turks. So definitely Turks are defending the Gallipoli Peninsula. The plan was for British, French, and Anzac forces. So these were the three forces to land on the peninsula at night at weak points. So they wanted to attack at the weak points. Their intention was to attack on those points where Turkish defense was weak. Okay. However, strong winds blew the troops off course. That means the troops of these three forces were blown off course due to strong winds. to better defended spots, which means their troops were blown to those points, those spots where the Turkish defense was not weak, it was instead strong, and the advantage was lost. So due to the strong winds, their advantage was lost as they were not able to attack on the weak points in the Turkish defense. Instead, they had to fight on the better defended spots where the Turkish defense was very strong. So what was the reason? The only reason was strong winds. So certainly this is gonna be the answer of our fourth question. Next is fifth, the outcome of the bitter fight with the Turks. So outcome means like result of the bitter fight with the Turks. So they fought with Turks was significant for Australia. So this bitter fight that they had with Turks was significant, important for Australia because it enabled them to take their place on the dash. So like they had to fight on the better defended spots with Turks. So after the fight, as it was bitter fight, definitely they lost the fight because Turkish defense was very strong. So after that bitter fight, that bitter fight actually was significant for Australia. It was important for Australia because it enabled them to take their place. So on what thing Australians took their place due to that fight? Let's find out. So here it is written, after the advantage was lost, what followed was 10 months of bitter fighting. So these three forces against the Turkish forces, they fought bitterly, in which 20,000 British and 7,000 Anzac soldiers were killed, and which ended in a successful withdrawal but no gain for the Allies. So they withdraw successfully, but they did not gain something. It was at this moment of history that Australia was propelled onto the world stage. So it was this moment. Which moment they are talking about? After the war, after the bitter fight with the Turkish defenses, that Australia was propelled onto the world stage. Like propel means like force or drive something. Like it can also be said as a motive. Like Australia went to it was like Australia moved on to, or Australia went to the world stage. From this moment onward, Australia began to think of itself as a country in its own right. So from this also, I think so that we are making the answer clear, because here also it is written that from this moment, Australia began to think of itself as a country of its own right. Like it was now, Australia did not think that it was a country ruled by British people. It was like it was thinking of itself as an independent country. So because it propelled onto the world stage, it moved onto the world stage. So this was after this bitter fight with the Turks, Australia enabled itself to move onto the world stage. Okay, so definitely our answer is gonna be world stage, because we have to tell in the answer that because it enabled them to take their place on the dash. So what was the thing that Australians took their place on? So definitely from the location it is clear that they took their place on the world stage because they were propelled onto the world stage. Okay, now next question, sixth question. John Monash commanded the Battle of Hamel so well that reports of the battle were published in order to be used. Dash. Okay, so John Monash, he commanded the Battle of Hamel very well, and he did it so well that the reports of the battle were published. So like reports of the battle were published in newspaper or something they're talking about, in order to be used. So why were the reports of the battle published? This is something that we have to write in our answer. So let's just take a look at the location of the sixth question. Here it is. The most prominent example was Journal Sir John Monash. So definitely they are talking about John Monash, who was an engineer by training. So he was an engineer. He commanded the Allied forces at the Battle of Hamel. He commanded the forces at the Battle of Hamel, like it was told in the question. So well, he commanded very well that the journal staff published the battle reports. He commanded it so well that the journal staff published the battle reports as a model. So which means that the journal staff published the battle reports of the battle to be used as a model, like as a standard, as a norm. So definitely this is gonna be the answer, because this is like a reason why they published the battle reports as a model, so that it could be used as a standard for the upcoming years or upcoming generation, whatever it is. So well, that reports of the battle were published in order to be used as a model. So as a model is our answer, and definitely it is within our limit of 3 words. So seventh question, that is the last blank. The Great War marked the beginning of modern Australia. So the Great War, that means the First World War, it marked the beginning of modern Australia. Like in the Australia, modernization began. They had emerged as a separate country. It was now a separate country, not controlled by British people, and would no longer have to live under the okay dash. So now they are like a separate country, and they do not need to live under dash. So what is the thing that they do not need to live under? Let's find out. We already know it's Shed of Britain. Ha 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 ha. So in the last paragraph, it is written that at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which marked the end of the war, so this was the end of the war, Australia signed as a separate country. So it was now a separate country. This reflected the fact that the cost of 60,000 dead, Australia had finally emerged from the shadow of Britain, which means now Australia has emerged from the shadow of Britain, which means it is not now controlled by Britain. It is an independent country, it is a separate country. So definitely it does not need to live under the shadow of Britain now. It is free from the shadow of Britain. It has emerged from the shadow of Britain. So this is certainly going to be our answer of seventh question. They had emerged as a separate country and would no longer have to live under the shadow of Britain. So with this, the blanks are over, and now let's move on to the question numbers 8 to 12, which are yes, no, and not given. Yes, if the statement agrees with the claims of the writer. No, if the statement contradicts with the claims of the writer. Not given if it is impossible to know what the writer thinks about this. So the first yes, no, not given question is, Australia's national debt increased greatly. So the debt of Australia increased greatly as a result of the Great War. So due to the First World War, Australia's national debt, it increased very greatly, significantly, you can say. So yes, its answer is yes, which means it is accurate, it is true what is written in the statement. It agrees with the claims of the writer. Let's see. Here it is written, which paragraph it is. It is second paragraph, last line, the national debt. So they are talking about the national debt of Australia, because firstly they were talking about Australia, which had stood at 6 million in 1914. So the war started in 1914, and at the beginning of the war, or you can say before the war, it was 6 million pounds. Yes, it was 6 million pounds, was 325 million pounds at the end of the war, by the end of the war. So due to the war, you can clearly see that the national debt of Australia increased from 6 million to 325 million. It is like a great gap of 319 million. So this is a huge amount, guys. So definitely due to the war, the national debt of Australia increased significantly. So the answer is gonna be yes. Moving on to the next question. Ninth, Australia made a great contribution to the successful outcome of the First World War. So, what was the outcome of First World War? They are saying it was successful, and Australia made a great contribution to that outcome. Okay, let's see. The answer is not given because outcome of the First World War is given. You can see here in the last paragraph, they are talking about signing the Treaty of Versailles, which marked the end of the war. So, end of the war that they are talking about, which means that at the end of the war, they signed the Treaty of Versailles. So, this is the outcome of the war, but there it is not written like that, that this outcome was a successful one or a failure one, like this treaty was successful or in the upcoming years it failed. So no information is given about whether the outcome was successful or not. So definitely from this also we can say that the answer is not given, but from this also we can say that the answer is not given because nothing is written in the passage about the great contribution of Australia towards this outcome. Like Australia was responsible for signing this treaty. Due to the contribution of Australia, the countries agreed to sign this Treaty of Versailles. So they are not talking about Australia's contribution to this outcome, that which was the outcome of the war. And due to the at the end of the war, they signed the treaty. So whether Australia made a great contribution towards this outcome or whether Australia made a less contribution towards this outcome, nothing is given about this in the passage. So our answer is gonna be not given. Next question, 10th. The British forces suffered a great number of casualties than the Anzac forces during the months of fighting with the Turkish. So this is the time when they fought with the Turks. This is the time that they are talking about, and during that fight they are saying that British forces, there were three forces, British, French and Anzac. So they are saying that British forces suffered a great number of casualties, which means like more soldiers of British army were injured or killed in the fighting or during the fighting than the Anzac forces. So the number of soldiers of the Anzac forces that were injured or killed was less than the British forces. The number of soldiers were more in the British forces who were like injured or killed during the battle with the Turks. So the answer is yes, it was so, they are saying. See, this was the paragraph where they were talking about the British, French, and Anzac forces, and when they fought with the Turkish defense, the Turks, and we also read this line that what followed was 10 months of bitter fighting, that the fighting was very bitter, in which 20,000 British and 7,000 Anzac soldiers were killed. So nothing else is given, just this is given, that in this battle 20,000 British soldiers were killed and 7,000 Anzac soldiers were killed. So as you can clearly see that 7,000 is far less than 20,000. 20,000 is greater than 7,000. So we can say that British casualties during this battle were more than Anzac casualties. British soldiers were killed more than the Anzac soldiers. So definitely the answer is gonna be yes, because it is as so as they are saying in the statement. Now 11th question. This is the second last question. Uh, Overall, the British had a higher proportion of soldiers killed or injured than Australia. So now they are not talking about a specific period or specific time. They are talking about the overall war. In the war, like overall, British had a higher proportion of soldiers killed. So soldiers were killed more that belonged to the army of Britishers or injured than Australia. So they are saying that Australian soldiers were killed or injured less in the war than British soldiers. So they are saying that British soldiers were killed or injured more often than Australian ones. So the answer is no. Let's see why is it so. Check this out. Last third paragraph, last third line, 11th question where it is written, of the 324,000 soldiers who served overseas in the war. So now they are talking about the soldiers of Australia. Yes, unlike in other armies in the war, the Australian soldiers were all volunteers. So definitely they are talking about the soldiers of Australia, and they are saying of the total soldiers who served overseas. From here also we can get the idea that they are talking about the soldiers of Australia, because it was the Australian soldiers who went overseas and fought in the war, not the British soldiers. So like 3,24,000 soldiers served in the war. So out of these soldiers, 2,15,000 were killed or wounded. So this 2,15,000, or you can say 215,000 soldiers, Australian soldiers, were killed or wounded, that means injured. This was the highest proportion of any of the countries in the war, and was probably due to the Australians' fighting qualities. So from here also we can come to know that they are talking about the Australian soldiers, because they are talking about the fighting qualities of Australian soldiers. So this number 215,000 was the highest number of any of the soldiers being killed or wounded or injured during the war out of the countries, the number of countries that participated in the First World War. So from all the countries that participated in the First World War, Australian soldiers were killed or injured more. This was the highest number in the war that were killed or injured of the soldiers. So definitely we can say, because it is written the highest, which means this number was also highest than that of Britain soldiers, British soldiers, soldiers of Britain. That means that Australian soldiers were killed or wounded more than the soldiers of Britain. So definitely in the statement they were saying that British soldiers were killed or injured more than the Australian ones. But here it is clearly contradicting the statement. So definitely our answer is gonna be no, because it is totally opposite of what they are saying in the question. So definitely answer is no. Now, the last question of the passage. Australian soldiers were never disrespectful to their superiors. So they are talking about the Australian soldiers, that they never disrespected their superiors, like they always respected their superiors. So the answer is no. Let's see why is it so. In last third paragraph from where we have located the 11th question, the first line they are talking about they. So they are also referring to the Australian soldiers, because they were talking about the soldiers of Australia. They were also more individualistic. So the Australian soldiers were individualistic and showed less respect for the rule book than other soldiers. So to comparing the soldiers of all the countries, it was the soldiers of Australia who showed less respect. Okay, so they were like they respected less their superiors, so they did not respect their superiors as much as the soldiers of other countries did. Okay, the relationship between ranks was more democratic, and officer had to win the respect of their troops. So it was like in the army of Australia that the superiors have to gain the respect of these Australian soldiers, their troops. Like it was not like that as they are superior they should like get respect naturally. No, it was not like that. Superiors had to gain respect of their soldiers, of their troops, by doing something, or I don't know what they did. So definitely when they did not try to gain respect from their soldiers, that were the times when Australian soldiers did not respect their superiors. So like it was like that they disrespected their soldiers at that time, when soldiers did not try to gain their respect. from their soldiers. So definitely it was not like that the Australian soldiers never disrespected, like they always respected their soldiers. No, it was not like this. They disrespected their soldiers at some times. So definitely it contradicts with this statement, and our answer is gonna be, the answer of the last question of this reading is gonna be no. So I hope that you would have understood all the answers and even got to know that from where these answers came, to know how I have marked those locations very successfully. You would have known that how these answers came. Still, if you have any doubt, you can ask me in the comment section anytime. I would be very delighted to respond to your comments. So I think so. This is goodbye. Thank you very much.